Hello, hello, hello. How are you doing?
Good, Dante. Good to see you again.
Great to see you as well.
Yeah.
Terry, it's been nice. We did a interview last time, and it was really good. We just broke down a couple of points about your practice. So do you want to do like a little recap about what you do in your practice?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm an internal family systems practitioner, or IFS. And IFS is both an approach to therapy. I do mainly one-on-one work, and also a tool for self-improvement. It becomes like a daily practice where we look at the mind in a very different way than we normally do in this culture. We see it as consisting of parts of us, and that's very normal. It's not a result of trauma, it's just a way that we're all born. And so what we find is that looking at the mind in this way, it's such a perspective shift on any number of levels that it really does facilitate healing in a big way.
Yeah.
So that's the 101 of IFS. Yeah.
101. Yeah, and I like that approach because I think what happens is people think that they are just one person, that they're just making one decision, and that they don't understand the whole idea of there's other parts of you that are making these decisions. And sometimes a decision that you're making, you go back on it and you're like, oh, why did I make that decision? So, and that can play out in relationships. And so that was the big theme and the topic that I love to share and talk about. It's something that is near and dear to my heart because in my past, I've had different relationships and I've struggled in relationships. And I would say relationships has been the most challenging aspect of my life. You know, with career has been fine. I've been figuring all that stuff out on my own, and my health has been really good. But the one struggle that I've had is in relationships. But there's also, of course, myself because I'm in a relationship. So walk me down what happens when when two people meet each other. Like, what happens when they meet each other on a conscious level and then on the back end on a subconscious level?
Yeah, it's so interesting what the research shows on this and from working with people. Whereas, and this is one of the great things about IFS is that our parts a lot of times operate on an unconscious level. And so what we're aware of consciously is a very small minority of what's going on in there. There's this whole, and Freud knew this on some level, there's this whole kind of deep ocean in there that to some extent is suppressed, but also it impacts, we're on autopilot a lot of times in day-to-day life. So in terms of relationships, even like who we're attracted to, it is largely determined by our trauma and what our unconscious is carrying. And so consciously we think, oh, this person looks a certain way that I like, or we have X, Y, Z in common. But that's just what, and those are good to have those things in common, but a lot of times that's just what the conscious mind is telling itself. And really there are these drivers underneath that, in terms of what our history is, what our upbringing was like, that are very often driving who we're attracted to. And, it's the same for the other person. This is a universal phenomenon. It's just a spectrum. It's not something that impacts some people and not others. So, that can obviously cause problems down the line when we think it's certain things that are bringing us to a person, but it's actually something else. And when there's unconscious dynamics at work, what we find is that invariably the other person is not going to be able to meet those unconscious needs that we have, because that's not what relationships are for. And so that's when a lot of the struggle starts, because there was an unconscious expectation coming in, oh, you're going to be my savior in a sense. You're going to meet this need that I have and this need. And then when that slowly doesn't happen, that's a lot of times when the angst kicks in and parts revolt against it. So, and this is different in every relationship depending on the pairing and who the people are involved, but this is often where the conflict starts. And a lot of times it's in that 6 to 12 month time frame. After that initial infatuation is over and things are getting more stable, that's when we see these dynamics start to play a bigger role.
Yeah, I did hear a term called limerence. Is like where you're able to, you have these big feelings for the person and it lasts between 3, 6, 9 months. And then once you get over that hump, then things start to reveal itself. But I find like in the beginning of dating someone, you're just getting to know them. You're figuring out, okay, what do you like? What do I like? What are your beliefs are? What are your values are? And as you start to dive deeper into someone, you're like, oh, wow, these characteristics are great. They like this, they like that. I like this, like that. And we can do all these different things with each other. We can go here, we can go there. That's like the high. And then there's comes a point where you start to figure out, oh yeah, this can work great. And then one thing happens, there's a conflict. So what triggers people on a subconscious level, and how do they, I think, rationalize it? Meaning that sometimes when triggers come, that they'll either blame the other person. So they'll use a lot of blaming terms like, you made me feel da da da, you did this and that, it's your fault. What happens when people get triggered and when people blame each other?
Yeah, and that's where it gets so interesting in terms of relationships, because we are usually more easily triggered by our romantic partner than by anybody else. And I think that the big reason for that is because that's where we're the most vulnerable. You know, there's a closeness there, and that person has the ability to hurt us that generally no one else has anymore. You know, and it used to be our parents who had that ability, but now it ends up being a romantic partner. And so there are a lot of parts of us who are either afraid of vulnerability, or who are at the very least leery of it based on prior experiences. So those parts are on high alert for anything that a person says or does, no matter how subtle, that could be interpreted in a certain way and could be triggering. So when we get triggered, by definition, it's past trauma that's being triggered. So your partner says something, that's a spark. The trauma is all the gasoline that we're carrying inside of us. That's what gets ignited. And so that's why we often find ourselves reacting in a way that an hour later we're like, why did I get so upset about that? Or like, what, you know, it's completely out of proportion to what the person said. And that's because it's really, we're reacting to the past. It feels like we're reacting to the present, but that was just the trigger. And that's where and that's where parts will come online and very quickly and either start blaming, like you said, because that's a defense. It's not my fault. You shouldn't have said that. Or parts will shut down. So a lot of times people go into a freeze response and they just can't talk. You know, they'll just completely shut down. And so different people have different strategies, again, depending on our history, like which parts are the most dominant. But when we're triggered, it's parts of us who essentially take over our seat of awareness, and they're the ones reacting, and those parts are usually very young, and they're stuck in the past. So when we say so-and-so is acting like a child, they are, because a young part of them has taken over, and that's the part responding, or shutting down, you know, or blaming. And normally what that does is it triggers, so if I react very strongly to something that my partner says, that's going to trigger her parts. And then it's a mutual escalation back and forth. And that's often why we find we have the same arguments over and over again, because it's parts arguing with each other. It's not our true essence, so nothing gets resolved.
Yeah.
So, yeah, does that kind of get at what you were?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have found that when parts gets triggered, sometimes people get into that mode and they can't, in a way, stop themselves or be aware of those parts coming up. And so what would be just like one tool that you would suggest to someone that if a part gets triggered, what can they do just to be aware of it and not lash out and blame the other person?
Yeah, and that's one of the powerful things about IFS and the parts awareness that it brings. Because the first step is having an awareness, oh, this is how the mind works, and oh, this is what's going on with me. So one of the big things I see is it turns on the self-compassion piece right away, because what we normally do is we'll overreact, and then we'll beat ourselves up about it for the next 3 days, you know? And that's what that is parts arguing with each other, which never solves anything. But as soon as we have this awareness, oh, these are parts who are hurt and who are actually trying to help me, even as toxic as the results may be most of the time, that turns on now I get it, like it makes sense. This is why I react this way. And then we're in a position to start noticing, and it's difficult at first because and it really is amazing the energy that parts have, the ability they have to completely take us over until they're done. And we don't get a vote, right? But what we can do, the more awareness we bring, and we'll start to recognize the same parts who are the big players, you know, day to day. And then it becomes easier, oh, there's that one. Come in again. And usually we feel it, a part will, we'll feel it in a certain place, like our jaw will get tense for anger, or our heart will start racing for fear. And that's how we learn. So a lot of times somatically is the way you feel it first. And with practice, and this is not like meditation where you have to spend 10,000 hours. Like this is it pretty quickly for most people. You with practice and with awareness, you get more and more able to catch it quicker. And then, what we do in IFS is we don't tell the parts to stop or go away because they're not going to listen to you like they think they have to do what they're doing. So we form relationships with them over time. And then once they're healed, they don't react that way anymore because they're not carrying all this gasoline from the past. So it is there's, of course, like anything else, effort up front to familiarize yourself with kind of this way of looking at the mind and get to know our parts. And then we're in a much better position to start catching them. If not right away, then you might, okay, well, I'll catch it within 10 minutes rather than 10 hours. And then the next time it's 5 minutes. And there's a progression there that pretty quickly people see big change from.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a level of just being aware in of itself, being aware of either your muscles getting tense or if your chest starts to cave in. In a way, you're talking about body language or how the body starts to respond, and being able to be aware of how your body responds, catch it, and then either breathing, doing something to just be in a way like calm yourself down, or
this is a great question. Sometimes in the short term that can help like get through a situation, but a lot of times what we find, and this is counterintuitive, is that breathing exercise, like focus on your breath for a minute. What that actually does is pushes the part away, and parts don't like that. So you may be able to get away with that. I'm in the middle of an argument right now. I just need some space, but the next time it's gonna be right there again. So it didn't really fix anything. So what we advocate, or what I would advocate, is okay, if you're in the heat of something, okay, do that, but let that part know you're going to get back to it. Either later tonight, tomorrow, because what the parts are saying indirectly is they need help from self, capital S self, which is what we call our real essence in IFS. And so you can ask a part, hey, let me handle this right now. I got this, and we'll talk later. And once the part trusts you a little bit, the parts will do it. I do this in sessions with people all the time. It's almost, people can't believe it. People will be completely overwhelmed in a panic attack. And as soon as you tell the part, as soon as the part understands it's in the part's best interest to, pull back the intensity, like we can't help you when you're overwhelming us, the part will do it. And so it's a similar type of thing in an argument where it's like, hey, I got this, and then let's talk later about what you're so upset about. So yeah, there is a progression there once the relationships get, again, once that trust is built, the parts are more and more willing to do that. And that's part of our, again, this in the moment thing that we were talking about, where the parts are more and more likely to say, okay, I trust you right now, and then we'll touch base later.
I see. So there's a level of getting to know your parts first, and then being able to step away and in a way reflect or communicate to that part first, see what it was needing, and then having that like aha moment or that light bulb. Be like, oh, okay, this is what you're needing. Let me take care of it, and then move forward. So
yeah, and then as the trauma is healed, again, the parts don't want to react this way. They don't like their jobs any more than we like the results of their jobs. So once that trauma is healed, they're very happy to not. The part will say, yeah, I don't need to jump in like this anymore. You got this. And the part parts oftentimes turn into like advisors at that point, where there's not all this gasoline anymore. They're reacting in the moment now rather than reacting from the past. And so there's not this explosion of energy anymore. It's just much more calmer way of relating to them, where you'll hear them in there at times, like, hey, don't forget about this or think about this, but there's not all this energy behind it so they're not triggered anymore at that point.
Yeah, I mean that's beautiful. I think that is in a way to go about relationships, especially in the beginning, because it seems that people don't look at themselves first, and they don't do that inner work or that inner reflection, but they get into a relationship, like you want a relationship, and think it's going to meet all their needs, it's going to make them more happier, but then when they're in the relationship, those parts really start to come out, and that gasoline really begins to come out, and it gets all over. It gets really messy. It does. It gets really messy. Yeah. And so, what would you say to a person that they're in that piece, that work? They're trying to do that work. I've been in a similar situation where there's either me and or myself doing that inner work, that work inside, but the outcome is there's, say, like a fine line between what the outcome is. So, for example, there's some level of physical violence involved, or there's things that are being damaged. What would you say to a person if they find themselves doing the work, but the outcome is really hurtful, really destructive?
Yeah, so those are parts who need to be the focus, right? So the parts that get angry and the rage, whether, like you said, whether it's against taking out on the person or property nearby, like that's a part there's so much gasoline in there that it just explodes when it's triggered. And so, if I'm working with someone with that, like that is our focus, and we're going to get to know that one. We're going to hear its story, what it's been through, how it's trying to help. And again, with parts like that, it can be hard to believe that they are trying to help. They are trying to protect us always. And once we hear that, again, so now we're in a place where, again, we're compassionate for that part's intention, not the outcome. Like, we're not sanctioning the outcome, but we're understanding, there actually is a positive intent. And what we find invariably is that a part like that, there's a two-tier hierarchy of parts. There are parts who protect, and then there are the parts that they're protecting. And these are the inner children, like the younger ones, the ones who are hurt, the ones who are carrying trauma. And when we heal these ones, then, as I said, these ones don't need to overreact anymore. So that's we're nipping it right at the root. Like, we're not trying to negotiate with this one and ask it to stop, because they're not interested in stopping. They think they have to do it until these ones are healed. And, the beauty of IFS, that's usually that's often not a lengthy process. Once we find the part who is involved in, establishing that trust, getting to the ones it protects, this is not years of therapy typically. And that's, so we see results pretty quickly, and that's the shift. And it may be that people have to separate for a while until that's done, like if there's danger involved. Sometimes that's the best thing, because then they're not triggering each other so much. But yeah, 'cause anything other than that, there are a lot of Band-Aids we try to throw on those things,
Right.
That aren't terribly effective a lot of time, and they're just kind of masking, masking the symptoms, but not dealing with what's underneath there.
Yeah, well, I definitely relate to that, because how important it is to do that inner work, to get to talk to the children, and to go into the root and to the core is very vital. And sometimes that work needs to be done just alone. Like, this person needs to have a little bit of space between the other person, because sometimes I have found that if they either do a session, they come back and they get triggered, and then there's more violence, what can happen is there's a cycle between the other person where there's a lot of resentment for what they did. And so they'll have that in their memory, like, oh, this person did this to me in the past, and they did that to me, and that creates the relationship history. So, there's that big cycle. What would you say to people who found themselves in that cycle of one person gets triggered, they do something, they do something that's really violent or something, and then the other person carries it and then get resentful, or they start to just hold all that stuff in? Like, what would you say in that big cycle?
Yeah, and it is a repetitive, like almost anything we see with trauma, there's this, Freud called the repetition compulsion. And this is an example. Everything's a loop, and it tends to be a mutually escalating loop over time, and until at least one partner or the other, in this case, like, starts to cut it off. But yeah, it's all parts. My part overreacts, and your parts will carry resentment, and understandably so, especially if there's property damage or physical, it's not that's, there's nothing wrong with resentment, but it's very toxic.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, until you deal with it, it doesn't go anywhere. And that's where the blame comes in. And what that's going to do is infuriate my parts even more. That's the issue, right? So you're reacting in a way that, I think we would all understand to some degree, but my parts then are going to take it up a notch, and then yours are going to take it up a notch. And so there's this, like you said, there's this cycle. And so again, one person or the other can cut that off, right? But it's very difficult. We were talking about this when we walked here. Like if two people, one of the what seems to be a law of the universe, which I find fascinating, and I see it now everywhere, is that when we tend to end up with people who are at the same more or less level of trauma that we are. Because if there's too big of a difference, neither one would put up with the other one.
Right.
And so that's part of the unconscious, like what am I attracted to, dynamic. But what we see, so either person can cut off this cycle, but if one person starts healing and the other doesn't, now we're creating a gap in the amount of trauma that they're each carrying, and that can actually increase conflict. Now, it may not increase physical, things like violence, because now at least one person can break that cycle. But it may increase the overall conflict of the relationship, and it may increase the odds of people just deciding this isn't working anymore. Now, if you're lucky, both people can get on the healing path, and then you're staying aligned, and that's a beautiful thing when that happens. That's unfortunately, on the rare side these days. But that's the type of thing. Like either person can cut it off, which is a great thing, but then it's going to keep coming back unless the work is done.
Right. Yeah, and I have found that when people do the inner work, or they're either working with someone and the other person isn't, or they might think they're against it, or they might have biases about therapy, then there does become that gap, because one person is trying to figure out, okay, there's something in me that in a way is causing this conflict, and so let me work with that. Let me go inside and see what's going on in me and change my relationships. But then the other person is not willing to work with someone and go within. They think that they can either do it by themselves, or that they can do something else. Sometimes I have found in the community that they just want to do plant medicine, or they want to just rely on other tools, or just do breathing exercises, or just meditate. And those are, in a way, I guess I call them medicines as my term. Like, these are good tools, yet it may not actually go to the root. And so what do you think about people who have like this bias towards working with another person, and also people who think that they can just do it by themselves by using plant medicine or just doing breath work and meditation?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. You and I both know, being guys, that we tend to be very resistant. Like men in this culture are taught, keep the emotions in, except anger. We're allowed to be angry. Anything else, don't show it, because that's weakness. And children will take messages literally. They'll take messaging like that very literally, and then those become parts in us who are stuck in that mode of operating. And you can be 90 years old and you've been the same way. Like it doesn't stop until either there's some life event or inner work is done. So that makes it very difficult for most men to even consider therapy in any serious way, because now you have to talk to another, you have to be vulnerable to another person, who's a stranger, at least at first. So that's a lot of the resistance. So look, I've felt it. I get it. It's much more difficult for us. Women have an easier time being open and working on themselves in that way. So I think sometimes there has to be a forcing function there, like one person in a relationship's doing their work, and sometimes an ultimatum has to be given. Like, look, I know this is hard for you to do this, but I need you to do this with me so that we can grow together. I mean, that's the type of thing that happens a lot. Psychedelics, plant medicines, in a therapeutic context, they can be extremely powerful. Doing them alone is not a therapeutic context for the most part. They have the ability to, we have defense mechanisms, what we call protector parts in IFS, that a lot of times will block access to the stuff we need to heal. And psychedelics for, a number of hours can get that out of the way so that you can better access what's in there. But if there's not a practitioner of some kind guiding you through that, you're so out of it on a psychedelic, it's almost impossible to really do inner work at that point, because ketamine mushrooms, they all really, to full dose, you're out. And so, and things may come up, but if you don't have someone there to literally hold your hand and guide you through, okay, what does this part need? Who's this part? Very, very difficult to do that alone. So a lot of solo psychedelic use that I see is, oh, this is a cool experience. Oh, some things came up, like I was very sad, a lot of them, but just being sad does not heal anything in my experience. Releasing, we have this notion that releasing emotions that are stuck gets them out, and I don't see that. It may, and there may be a short-term benefit to that, but that part is still there and is still feeling that. It still has that energy. So only through some kind of, I mean, with IFS we focus on the unconscious, but some kind of deep process to really get at the root and heal that things, do I see those types of things being effective. And breathwork's the same. Like, breathwork can bring on a lot of the same effects it does for me. We work together on that as a psychedelic, but it's the same thing. Like, without someone holding space or something hard. And some people, they'll do one psychedelic journey, again, therapeutically, and see massive, massive benefits, because that's how powerful it is if there's someone there to hold the space and to guide you through. But I don't see too much of that with the solo work. I wish it were that easy. We'd be in a lot better shape, but
No.
it doesn't seem that way.
Yeah, no, I understand. I have found that when we do work with someone and there's someone guiding and helping, it does make massive changes. I've done plant medicine, and it's really affected my life. It's made a big difference. I think I would be in a different place if I didn't do the plant medicines with a shaman and work in that regard. And of course, breath work and meditation has helped me tremendously in my life. And then, so it's been massively great benefits.
Nice.
And then at the same time, I have seen people solely rely on those tools, and then they don't get into that deeper work of the parts connecting to childhood, or they don't really go there. And so also too, another thing you mentioned, which was interesting, is like catharsis, like just almost like letting things out. How sometimes just letting things out isn't enough. You have to go into the part and say, okay, what is coming out? What part is coming out? Trying to do a little more research there. So like people like hitting the pillow and doing that type of work is nice, but at the same time, like what you said, just going a little bit deeper is really important. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, again, I wish there were an easier way. And not that I find IFS remarkably easy compared to what we're used to, which is years and years of therapy, in a very slow trajectory. And that's not typically what we see with IFS. It's much quicker to see results. But yeah, the hitting pillow stuff, and there are some approaches I've seen in group contexts where the facilitator, again, in a therapeutic, very held space, will have someone do that with everyone holding space for that person while they do it. And with the facilitator in a very expert way encouraging, okay, let this out in this way. Because they, if you've been doing this long enough, you can sense when something's helping or not. So there's a difference between just hitting a pillow in your bedroom on your own and actually doing it, again, just like a psychedelic in a therapeutic context. Then I've seen that be very powerful. It's not saying that I don't see it to be necessary for most people. Like there are other ways of releasing this stuff in my experience, but that can be one of them. But again, there has to be a set and setting is the common term that we use, and that's critical.
Absolutely. Yeah, beautiful. So I think that when it comes to relationships, like after the relationship, let's say there comes a point where a person says, okay, I've been doing this inner work and I'm ready to leave my partner, and I'm starting to figure out what my parts are, how they respond. Then they get that knowledge, then they start to go out into the dating world. Having that knowledge of your parts, having knowledge of how your body responds and how it triggers, now we're starting to meet other people who may not know this stuff, or maybe who have heard it but never done it. Do you think how important is it to start that process when you're meeting a person? like when you're starting to date, be like, okay, like what work have you done on yourself? Like how important is it to ask those type of questions?
Yeah, it's something that I try to get a sense of, very quickly, because I think there has to be, at least for me, there has to be some kind of alignment there, right? And again, because otherwise the gap is going to be too big, and it doesn't mean the other person is broken or anything, but there's we have to be aligned on some fundamental spiritual and like self-growth things for me, and I think it's problematic when you're not. It may not seem that way at first, but it's going to veer, because you're going to keep growing, and the other person is going to keep not, most likely, if they're not already, and so that gap is going to increase. So that is part of, I think that's part of an assessment process, in terms of, okay, what's your journey look like? What do you think about self-improvement? And these are questions that it's almost like asking someone who they voted for. It can be out of the gate. It's not necessarily where you go, but for me, I think you get a sense pretty early on. The other thing that's helpful is, again, after a relationship, and this is a difficult question for a lot of us, is to really ask, what am I looking for in a relationship? Because just saying love, for example, that's very vague and non-specific. And the reason that's an important question is because we tend to look for too much. We ask for too much from our partners. And I think there's a cultural piece to that, because we evolved in small hunter-gatherer tribes, 50, 100 people. There were always people around. Everyone saw everyone else pretty much every day, small community. So there was a tight community that we don't have today. And as a result, we tend to need, our needs now need to be met by a smaller number of people. And even friends today, there's studies on this, that a lot of friendships aren't as deep now as they were, because we're separate. We're online all the time. We're texting rather than meeting in person. And so the person that we live with, if we're cohabitating, now becomes that primary person that we're looking to get emotional needs met from. And that is problematic when we have parts who are traumatized, who are still trying to get childhood needs met from our partner, because our partners don't sign up for that, because this is all unconscious. So they don't, there's no awareness of this. And that also impacts who we're attracted to. So if I have parts who are very anxious, and there's a lot of fear, I'm going to tend to be attracted to people who are macho and who are tough and who don't show fear, like they're brave. If I have parts that are narcissistic, I'm going to tend to be attracted to people who won't say no to me, people pleasers. So there's a dynamic of who we're attracted to and what we're looking for, that if we don't have a sense of that, that's when we get ourselves into trouble. Because what the other person is willing to provide is often very different than what our very young parts are looking for, and that's always going to break down again after this little honeymoon phase that you talked about earlier. Like, that's when we start seeing more of that stuff.
So coming into a relationship first, asking what are you looking for, what type of love you're looking for, and then how do you want to show up in a relationship is a vital question, right? Like how do you want to show up? What do you want to do for the other person? Because I think sometimes people have that mindset of like, oh, this person's going to do X, Y, and Z and X, Y, and Z, instead of like, well, what am I willing to do for the other person? What do you think about it? Because there's like, what am I willing to do? And then what sometimes happens is people say, I'm being taken advantage of. This person is asking too much of me. So if they don't ask themselves, well, what am I willing to do? Then, in a way, like, I'm talking about like boundaries, really. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's important, and it's not practical up front to be explicitly having all these conversations. So there's a balance, but yeah, understanding certainly what we're both looking for, just in terms of like type of relationship, obviously is helpful. But also, really, mainly because we know ourselves the best, right? So when we look inwards, we can get a sense of, again, what are my parts looking for? Like, am I chronically lonely? Because that's not a reason. It seems like a relationship will fix that, but it never does. Like, the parts, because they're looking for something more than the person can give you. So what are the real drivers? And that takes some work and some introspection and awareness to understand what needs am I looking to get met. And that's going to set the stage for then, having these types of conversations with the other person, like to see how aligned are we. What's a requirement versus a desire, meaning what can I compromise on, versus what is like a red line that I'm not willing to, like what boundary am I not willing to remove? You know, and there's a lot of, and typically the dynamic, again, the people who get together, there's one person who's, and I'm generalizing, but there's the pursuer and then there's the withdrawer. Right? So there's the person who really wants that secure attachment, like really, really, not even, it could be insecure too, but like is really, really wants to be in a relationship, really wants to be with that person. And the other person oftentimes wants more space. So it's kind of like this. And then what happens is eventually this person who's pushing towards will get sick of the withdrawal and they'll withdraw. And then this person goes this way. So there's this dynamic like this that you'll see a mile away once you get used to it. And you know, to a degree we all do this. But just noticing that, because eventually that cycle is going to break down. And that cycle is what happens again when there's not an understanding up front of what is my attachment style, what are my parts looking for, what do I expect, right? If I want more space, if I want more alone time than my partner, and if there's a big gap there, that's going to be a problem. Not up front because we're not living together yet.
Yeah.
But when we talk about moving in and like then all these things become bigger issues as time goes on and the intimacy increases. So, and that's where, okay, am I willing to compromise long term, like some of my alone time, like can I or not? But we have to understand ourselves to really be able to answer that question, because it's very easy to say yes, I'm willing to compromise with it without thinking about it. That's a very rational answer, and that's another part responding. That's not the part who actually has the need answering. So yeah, there's a lot. It's you know, I don't want to make it sound too daunting, but it really, if you look at the amount of time we spend in conflict in relationships, if we're actually saving time by doing the inner work, because we're going to save ourselves a lot of aggravation on the back end, and so it, you know, there's a danger talking about this sometimes where, oh, this is a lot of work, I can't do this, this is overwhelming.
Right.
I promise it's not.
Yeah.
You know, it's steps. You know, it's not all at once. You know, as we grow and as we become more self-aware, these things just evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my mind, it seems that when we do the work over time, we get better results. We get rewarded later on. But I find if you don't do that work and you just get the short-term pleasures, then later on you're going to get a really bad outcome.
Yeah.
So it's the whole like short-term work, great outcome, short-term like pleasures, then long-term pain.
Yeah, totally.
And the pain has been, you know, of course, divorce. It's been people's hurting each other. It's been financial, a lot of different pains, breakup in the family home, children being hurt by all of it. So there's definitely a lot of positives by doing a little bit of work over time.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned children. Like, children are so sensitive to their environment. They're aware of everything, unconscious, whether they can rationally explain it or not. They're aware of conflict between parents. Their hearing is impeccable. You know, our ears are shot comparatively by the time we're adults, but kids hear everything. And they know, like, they're very attuned to emotions, because when we rely on people for our survival, which kids do with their parents, we're naturally impeccably attuned to every little thing that's going on with those people, because that's how we stay attached.
Yeah.
Right? So kids will pick this up a mile away, and this stress just passes. We pass it down like a virus. It's not intentional, but this is how trauma passes down between generations. It's not necessarily the big stuff, physical abuse, sexual abuse. It's the day-to-day stressors for most of us is what it is. And this is not to be scary, like, but part of the, you know, we're doing the work for ourselves, certainly, but once kids are involved or they're coming, that much more important for their sake, to do this work and to minimize the day-to-day stress in the house.
Yeah, so you would recommend this work for people who want children, or who have children, so that they can do that work not only for themselves but for their children. And also there's a level of, I think I've also found that sometimes our lives can be really impacted by what we've seen in childhood, and it can it can really affect us on an emotional, mental, spiritual level. And so not passing or minimizing how much you pass down can really benefit the child's well-being overall. So it's almost like we have the physical well-being of, you want to make sure that your child is taken care of, clothes, clothes, education, food, all those basic stuff. So we think of it like, oh, that's really important, but then there's that subtle level that you want to also provide and give to your child, of emotional and being able to have a beautiful interaction, or a realistic interaction, but an authentic interaction with your spouse, because of course they're going to see that and they're going to be affected by it. So making sure that it is healthy and holistic, and there's some level of harmony between you and your spouse.
Yeah, so well said. It's hard to overstate the impact that has on kids. Again, not saying that to be scary, it's just a reality. On brain development, this has been studied for decades, how stress hormones impact brain development, slow things down. And, our brain gets wired in a certain way, and it's not that you can't change it, but that large way, that becomes who we are to a large extent. Like it's driving a lot of skills that we either have or don't when we get older. So important, and it helps. I found my daughter's 6, and they can really, she's my barometer, because if I get the slightest bit annoyed at something, she calls me out. Don't get upset, Papa. I don't even know I'm annoyed yet. Like she's got it. Like she can see it a mile away. So it's really a beautiful thing when that relationship is there, and again the kid has to feel safe doing that there aren't going to be consequences. But kids will let you know. They notice everything, and so they can actually help the process along at that point, because they'll call you right out. They have no filter. Right. They don't have the social graces that we do, and it's for me it's been really helpful.
Absolutely, very cool. Well, I appreciate this conversation. I think next time I would love to dive deeper into attachment styles and how that impacts our relationships. What are the cycles? What are the pitfalls in those different dynamics, and how can we break out of those cycles with attachment styles? So I'd love to go more deeper into that. Next
that
time.
sounds amazing.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. This is wonderful. Great to chat with you.
Nice chatting with you as well. Awesome.